All right, well, you all are making your way to a seat. My name is Era Swanson. I'm part of the consultant team working on this project with Rick Schaefer and Tetra Tech, as well as the task force. And before I turn it over to Rick, just oh yes, if the task force members who are present could stand up and give a little wave so the folks here know who you are. They will probably have some questions about the process that you all went through to present this information tonight. Rick is going to give a presentation about that process and the alternatives that you all may have had a chance to take a look at the back. And then I will help facilitate some Q&A for about 25 minutes after Rick's presentation, and then we'll break. You can go back and look at those pictures and boards and give us your comments.
Thank you, Era. Well, thank you for sharing your lovely evening here with us, and we appreciate the turnout. I wasn't too sure. I didn't almost turn around myself, but it was a attempt. So tonight we've been on this process for a while now, and we're going to share the outcomes of the evaluation process. And we'd like your feedback on the alternatives that we have arrayed across the back, and which we'll talk about somewhat here in the presentation. We'd like to know, what you like about them, what you may not like about them, and what's most important to you. And I'm already seeing a few comments. I'm very pleased with that. People in Edmond sometimes are a little too polite, and I know I live here, but it's nice to hear what's really on people's minds, because we need something to calibrate to. So, in our prior meetings, the project team, city staff, and the advisory task force have found your comments to be illuminating and very helpful. And I have to say that at every task force meeting that we've held, somebody has brought up some viewpoint that they have heard at one of these meetings. So it's been a very positive process. To represent the task force, I'd like Mike Nelson, co-chair of the task force and also council member here at the city, to say a few words about their work.
Thank you very much, Rick. And what a good-looking group you all are, huh? I wish I was in shorts. So, as I'm one of the co-chairs with my good partner there, Jim Wolvers, in the background from the port, and the task force is unique in that it comprises of folks from different agencies at the state level: WASDOT, Washington Department of Transportation, Ferries Division, Sound Transit, Community Transit. It goes on and on. There's just a lot of different entities, and we're all in the city, and of course we have several citizens, one of them representing business, all trying to put in input to try to put together some recommendations. And it's been a wonderful process, very collaborative, challenging. We've had gone from over 50 to narrowing it down. And some of you already have this wonderful sheet, we'll see, but if you walk away with anything tonight, if you take this with you and look at this, it's a little complicated, we'll walk you through it, but this really will kind of let you know where the things have bubbled up and have scored, and we'd like to know what you think about it. We want to know, do you like them? Do they need to be improved? Do you like one more than the other? Is there something we didn't consider? So it would just be, this is the last open public meeting for the task force. And so this is a really great opportunity to really have an impact before we make a recommendation to the mayor. So with that, I will turn it over to Rick. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. So as Mike mentioned, this is the fourth meeting, and we have found the input from the prior three meetings very instructive. We've had a lot of participation between those who have attended in person, as well as those who have visited the site online. And we've got a lot of nice comments out of it. I don't think we've had any real scolding comments. It's all been very, very constructive. So we're looking forward to more of that tonight. And so how this is going to work, we'll talk here for a little while. We'll have a question and answer session afterwards, and then you're free to look at things in greater detail, the displays, talk to me, talk to other project staff and the task force, and we'll learn something from you all. So, as I mentioned, we've been through a bit of a process. We've had, this is our 4th meeting, but we've taken a number of ideas that we've gathered from our team, from prior studies, from the community. We've screened through those in what we call level 1, and from there we've developed a series of alternatives. We've just gone through the detailed evaluation of those alternatives and detailed those evaluations. We want to have another meeting here with you all before the task force starts to formulate the recommendation. Now, I want to emphasize, they very specifically decided we're not going to go make a provisional recommendation. We want to air this out one more time before we go forward on this. So the iron's hot to strike. So this is from early days. These are the myriad alternatives or solution concepts that were forwarded in level 1, that we went through and evaluated them using a conceptual set of criteria or qualitative set of criteria. And again, the idea is to come up with near-term and short-term solutions to address the 4 major needs that were set forth for this study. 1, improving reliable emergency response access, providing for emergency evacuation of the waterfront when needed, reducing delays to the loading and unloading of ferries, and improving the circulation and reducing delays and conflicts for all modes of transportation in the vicinity of the railroad crossings. So basically we have a series of different types of solutions that were thrown out to us to work with. Roadway overpasses from the railroad, roadway underpasses of the railroad, emergency response solutions on the water side of the track, operational solutions that might reduce conflicts, railroad track modifications, raising, lowering, the train trench was one of those alternatives, and modifying the ferry terminal, including relocation. So quite a range of options. We screened through those as a task force, and we came up with 6 early recommendations or near-term recommendations, and 13 of these solutions we've advanced into the 2nd stage. We've consolidated features of them and created 10 alternatives. Now I'll explain a little later how we ended up with an 11th alternative when the Edmonds Crossing, or a revised version of the Edmonds Crossing project, was reintroduced in the level 2 evaluation for consideration. So there were 6, like I said, early action recommendations that were forwarded by the task force. And but 2 of them were improving pedestrian safety and comfort in crossing down at Main Street, crossing tracks at Main Street and Dayton. And those are actions that the city could take on, directly. There were also 3 different suggestions for improving safety as far as evacuation and emergency evacuation and general evacuation out of the waterfront. And what the task force recommends there is that these be included with other relevant provisions in a different process that would involve the different stakeholders that would be involved in emergency response. The city goes through emergency operation planning on a continuous basis. This may be something that those stakeholders, folks from the hospital district, from police and fire, as well as others, can be involved with. And then finally, an operational solution that was proposed is coordination between the 911 system and the railroad, that when there's a 911 call across the tracks, it's communicated to the railroad they need to stop their train short of Edmonds so they're not blocking the tracks. Just it's not a guarantee, but an idea to try and reduce the conflicts and avoid delays in emergency response. So those are the first ones out of the gate. Nice and bright, huh? This basically is how we merged some of the level 1 concepts and moved them on into level 2. So there were 13 different concepts that ended up getting advanced into one of these alternatives in level 2. And here are the locations. And this also shows the 11th one, which is the Edmonds Crossing. We've used a color scheme here. The orange ones are overpasses and underpasses that are accessible on foot. And you'll see them displayed in the back left corner of the room. And the idea is that they're located, one, where they'll be helpful for intermodal passenger connections, say between the ferry and the railroad or bus transit, and but also emergency personnel can go over on foot, and as part of these alternatives, there would be an aid car stationed on the west side in a locked facility so that they can get to where they need to, and they have the tools that they need to respond. Most of our emergencies that have been reported over on the other side of the tracks have been aid car calls. A small number have been fire calls, but we do have both. And of course, a large number of them are for getting to the Marine Patrol, the rescue boat in the marina. The red ones, which have 3 of those, up in the north end at Edmund Street, at Dayton Street, and then down the south end below the Point Edwards development and Unical property. And those would be single lane roadways that are intended for emergency vehicle access and also for general use for pedestrians and bicyclists. So they become part of the trail system as well. They would not be open for general traffic. They may be used in an emergency, say if we have an extended shutdown, the train stuck across, with the grade crossings closed, you could offload a ferry, in single file, but that's not something you'd want to do on an ongoing basis. But emergency vehicles, both aid cars and fire trucks, would be able to access the waterfront directly without interruption. The ones in blue, and there are 5 of them over here, Edmonds Crossing, a couple different alternatives at Main Street, actually 3 different alternatives at Main Street, and then one at Dayton Street, are alternatives that would provide for revised loading and unloading of the ferries, as well as emergency vehicle access to the waterfront. We have things like the Edmonds Crossing. Those of you who have been here for a while are aware of that. This is a scaled down version of it, but it would basically load cars and store cars over in the Unical site and take them over to a new ferry dock sticking out basically off the south end of the marina. The Dayton Street New Ferry Terminal would build a garage in the Harbor Square area, and that would queue vehicles, and then they would go over a trestle and to the north of the fishing pier, and that would be a new terminal as well. And then we have 3 alternatives that would modify the existing ferry terminal. And one is an underpass, and then 2 different scales of overpasses. Again, there's details on each of these, and with a list of kind of the major pluses and minuses as we've identified them in the evaluation. In the evaluation, we had 11 criteria that were developed, and we discussed this at our last meeting in different areas. Some of these have up to 9 subparts to them, and the task force has gone through and evaluated each of the alternatives using these criteria and documented, given them a score for that criteria and documented the reasoning behind it. Copies of those are available to view in the room here afterwards. We have notebooks with those. And this is kind of the results of it all right now as it stands. This is where we're at. We applied a numerical ranking for each of these criteria, 0 through 5. 0 if it's fatally flawed, 5 if it does a great job of enhancing the functionality or benefit. And using those 11 criteria without just all evenly weighted the same, we've got check marks here identifying which ones came out as highest rated amongst the different types of alternatives. And so what we have is the mid-block overpass came out as the best rated alternative using this system amongst the pedestrian overpasses. The emergency vehicle access, the Edmund Street overpass came out with the best score. And it was a tie between Edmonds Crossing and the Main Street Ferry Overpass minimum build, we call it. We have 2 different scales of improvements there. The difference between the minimum and the full build is the amount of vehicles queuing capacity that we have waiting to get on the road. The minimum build provides the same or just slightly more vehicle queuing than we presently have. And then the full build would meet the guidelines, the operating guidelines that Washington State Ferries prefers to use. So that's a great number more cars. Understanding that different criteria would be valued differently by different people, and also kind of to test the sensitivity of how we apply the criteria, we took various slants at weighting certain criteria in different categories. So looking at, emphasizing emergency response, we increased the weight for a couple of those related criteria and looked at the numbers, and the outcomes really didn't change. We also looked at traffic-related criteria and stressed those in the evaluation. And again, we didn't see much change. When we stressed urban design, temporary construction impacts, environmental effects, and ability to address sea level rise, we did see a little shift. The Edmonds Crossing popped up instead of the Main Street minimum build. And as far as emergency vehicle access, the Admiral Way overpass, the one at the south end by Point Edwards and the port, got a higher score. So we just wanted to see how sensitive this was, because again, everybody, different things are important to people, and wanted to just have a look at that, kind of a stress test. So from here, we evaluated things, and we decided not to go ahead and formulate recommendations. Wanted to have this 4th meeting beforehand. But what will happen after this is the input that we get from this meeting will be considered by the task force as they formulate their recommended plan. Again, we are charged with looking at near-term and longer-term projects, understanding that large projects like loading, things that can help us load the ferry are going to take a long time to plan, to permit, to design, to finance, and to construct. So don't want to wait too long before we get some relief. But we also don't want to be solving yesterday's problem or just today's problem. We want to be solving, we want a solution that we're going to be living with for a long time that's going to work for the city. So after this, task force will formulate its recommendations, forward those to the mayor. The mayor will consider those, and then he will report to the council on what he considers to be the most appropriate plan of action for the city and the path that we ought to pursue. So I've tried to keep it brief so we can focus on what your questions are, because there are probably plenty, and I'm probably not hitting them all here. So thank you.
Okay, so before we get to your question, we'll get to you first. Just want to go over a couple of ground rules. I think you're familiar with these. They're the same as last time. If you can keep your questions to clarifying what you heard from Rick in the presentation rather than comments, that would be wonderful. There is plenty of opportunity to comment in the back. We've got little sticky notes that you can write your notes on each of the alternatives. We've got flip charts that you can write your thoughts. We've got printed copy comment forms, and we've also got the online open house both here, but you can also do it anytime now through September 28th at home. So there's lots of opportunity to comment. I know there's not a ton of us here today, but do try to ask one question and let others speak before you come back to a second question. I will repeat your question so that everyone can hear, which will give Rick and others a little time to think about their answer. And then if you can just avoid repeating a question already asked, that'll help maximize the time for all of us. All right, so let's start with you.
Okay, all of these solutions, do they address in any way, shape, or form train whistles and track noise?
Okay, the question is, do any of the alternatives address noise? Specifically, you mentioned train whistles and track noise. Rick?
These are not specifically addressing that. There's a separate project that should actually be happening quite soon, which is to put what we call wayside horns in place. And I think the city's been working quite a while with Burlington Northern to get that all figured out. The idea is there will be fixed horns at the crossings so that when a train is detected and approaching a crossing, that local horn would sound, but the trains don't have to blow their horns all the way through town. So that it would still be loud enough to meet federal regulations at the crossing, but the noise will not be as widespread through town. So that's what's going on there. But none of these will completely remove at-grade conflicts from the railroad. Local traffic will continue to have to deal with trains passing. That's one thing. And there will need to be gates and horns and lights.
Okay, here in the back.
Hi. This is the city of Edmond, and one thing which I believe was not really addressed is the view. I see you have small portions of segments of what you propose, but if you could come up with a three-dimensional project, either a sculpture or online, some video, I think the masses of people would be very surprised when they see what the accomplished overpasses are really going to look like. And I think it would be a good idea to address those sooner rather than later. So if you could help give us a view of what your proposals actually look like, I think a lot of people, other than myself, would really appreciate that.
So maybe to frame that as a question, Rick, is there a plan for these alternatives to have more 3D or real images to help folks understand them better?
Okay, thank you. I understand. In fact, I'll tell you, just seeing what we have produced, it really makes it tangible. We have a limited budget for what we can do in terms of rendering, but those three images you see there, and we picked those simply because they were leading candidates based upon the evaluation outcomes. Those are three-dimensional models set on the landscape, at their location. And we produced one image from each of them. We can produce additional images. It's just a matter of being able to work within the budget that we have for it. So we're looking at, we have enough budget to do one more 3D model in case there's a recommendation that comes together that's different than any one of these three, and some budget for creating a few more images. Right now it's a budgetary constraint, but they are valuable, obviously, to show the impacts. And view was very highly considered in the task force in the criteria, because obviously we were all aware of it going in, and also so it's been considered heavily there. And when we did the weighting scheme, looking at urban design, that stressed the view consideration as well. And that's why you saw a little shift in that category.
Okay, right here.
Just a brief comment first. I want to thank the task force and the consultants for the amount of work that this represents. It's a bunch of work. Thank you. Thank you for digging into it. I have two questions, so I'll save the second one, and you can come back to me. Question about emergency access. So there are a couple of pieces. It appears that, personally, I've taken off the Main Street crossing. It just doesn't work. So looking at the crossing at the south end as emergency vehicle access, what is involved in having a single lane drop down onto is it Admiral on the other side, Admiral on that side, and what is the Edmonds Street crossing, which I think is a single line, and has consideration been given to both?
So if I can repeat your question, emergency access at Edmund Street for single lane, and then the second area you
that could be
mentioned?
explained a little bit more what that
Okay,
is.
explain that a bit more, okay.
And that it's not, I don't think it's shown in a drawing, but emergency access at the south end, at the Edmonds crossing, how would that serve the waterfront? And then there'd be another one in detail about, has anyone done any guesswork in 10 years? How many trains we're going to have in here with the explosion of oil and coal additional trains exploding? I didn't know that I was doing that. But so where are the calls and how often do they occur? And do we have any guesswork of how often we'll need to get aerially over?
Okay, let's start with that
Start with the
first
first
one on the emergency
Okay.
access for Edmonds Crossing.
Okay, the Admiral Way overpass is one of those single lane vehicle options. And it would come from the Unicole property, it would climb, it would cross over the alignment for the realignment of Willow Creek. It would go over the railroad tracks and it would land down here in the port property. And that would be the single lane emergency vehicle access and also open for pedestrians and bicycles. So it would make a nice loop within our trail system here in Edmonds. Of course, it would not be open for general traffic. The Edmund Street overpass is a similar one-lane roadway. It would start off at the intersection of Sunset and Edmund Street. It would come off of there. It would have to rise a foot or two to get the proper clearance over the railroad tracks. And then it would bend, it would turn as it's going over the tracks, and then it would land roughly, we see in the vicinity of the bathhouse in the park, kind of on the track side of that. So, and what's nice about that alternative is you're only building one leg of the bridge, not both legs, because you're already elevated. The downside is, and I'll just elaborate some of the stuff on there, we are building in a shoreline environment. I'm an environmentalist. That people have concerns about that. It is though 4 blocks from the fire station. That's the closest access we have to the waterfront for emergency response. So there you go, pluses and minuses. Your second question.
Second question was on projected growth of rail traffic.
Oh, yes.
I mean, how often in 10 years, in 20 years, is the flat access going to be blocked?
Right. Okay, I think at our last meeting, I presented some statistics in terms of what the closure times are, the number of closures we have on average. We actually found some 24/7 videotape from tape. Okay, that's how old I am. Videotape of the Main Street crossing for half a month, late June and early July in 2012. Now, that's when traffic was down. But we were seeing, I think it was like 40 trains a day. We got these crossings. We had totaled up the time. We actually looked at how many cars were delayed, how many pedestrians were delayed. We totaled that all up in terms of vehicle hours and pedestrian hours per day. And I don't have those numbers right on the tip of my tongue. I got a lot of extraneous data in my head. But it was pretty surprising what we saw. Now, as far as growth in delays, that's the studies that we've been able to find show projections that run between 50 to 100% growth in train traffic in the next 15 years or so. That's a lot more trains. That's a lot more closures. That's a lot more interrupted ferry loadings. And that does not reflect what's going to go on with oil or coal, because it's such a volatile market, you don't want to try and project that. This is just looking at grain, merchandise, materials of all sorts. That's the growth that the railroad industry is projecting. Between the railroad industry and the maritime associations in the North Coast area, that's what we're looking at, irrespective of any fossil fuel. So that's why we talk about, let's think about tomorrow's problem, not just today's or yesterday's.
Yes, right here.
There's just a little bit of a terminology conflict here between Edmund Street Overpass and Edmonds Crossing. It seems like you could change the title of one or the other, so you're not duplicating. I don't mentally know which one you're talking about.
So the question just, could you change the
Yeah.
titles of those two alternatives?
Yeah.
Of Edmonds Crossing and Edmonds Street Overpass?
I suppose we could. Edmonds Crossing has an identity because there was a project proposed to relocate
I'm
things.
new here, so
Yeah.
I didn't know.
That's why I said anybody who's been here a while would understand it.
Okay.
And it went through the whole environmental review process, and then the economy decided to take a vacation. State budgets cut back, and then we also had, as I recall, we have ferry people here, but all of a sudden we had 4 electric class boats we had to replace. So budgets were strained and nothing was going to happen for a while. Now the state is going to embark upon long-term planning. And this gets back, I'll use this as an opportunity to kind of get into another aspect of what the task force is probably going to be considering as they put together a recommendation. And that is the timelines for these things. The state is going to be reviewing their long-term plan, and they're going to use the information from what we've come up with here to inform that in part. But they're looking at their entire ferry system and figuring out what their priorities are and how things are going to age and what they're going to have to take care of. And so this will be feedback to that. But that's a process that really has to be run by ferries. So the question is, until that can all happen, which by the time you deliver it, we're talking a couple decades till something happens. What are we going to do in the meantime? And so what the task force is probably going to look at is, a phased set of solutions. What do we do immediately? What do we do in the next 5 years? And then what might we do in the longer term? And the idea being, you're going to want to put together a plan that you're not building throwaways, that you're building components of an integrated system. So.
Yes, right here.
What's your time frame to come up with your recommendation and transmit it on to the mayor?
Just to repeat it, the question is the time frame for recommendations, for task force recommendations, and to pass those on to the mayor.
I'm not going to rush the task force, but now we're going to get into a deliberative process here of trying to formulate this. I could anticipate, I'm looking at them in the face, I could think this could take 2-3 meetings, and we meet about 2 meetings a month. So this could be going on for a little bit, and then present that to the mayor. But we're looking to get this thing done here soon, but I'm not going to force them to, after all of the work they've been put into it, I don't want to shortchange them on time. Bill?
I was just going to add, we had initially tentatively put on the council's agenda on October 11th. That's not going to happen. We talked about that this morning. That's clearly too fast. Talked to the mayor about it. He's going to take some time. Of course, after the task force makes recommendations to him, he's got to go through his own process as well, looking at what the task force has suggested and then come up with his package to take to the council. So you're really looking into November easily.
Thank
right
you.
here.
Could you give us any idea about funding as well as cost of the alternatives?
Okay, question is, any costs or funding related to the alternatives?
Yes. As you can imagine, these things have quite a range of costs. And why don't I just kind of summarize the ranges of those? I meant to do that, but I stopped looking at my notes while I was giving the presentation. For the pedestrian overpass approaches, including the cost of the 8 cars, we're looking at a range from $6 million to $21 million. That's all in. That's planning, design, permitting, right-of-way acquisition, construction, and with contingency. I mean, we're talking about planning level costs at this point. So there's a healthy, what-if factor in all that. The single-lane bridges, those will range from 24 to 29 million, depending on the configuration where they're located. And then the ferry alternatives, everybody kind of get a grip on the side of your chair. Those will run from 128 million to 357 million. That very expensive one is the underpass option, because it's just the kind of construction one has to do, excavating below the groundwater table and in a congested area. And the other thing that complicates it when you're working at an operating ferry dock is maintaining operations while you're constructing. That adds time, it adds cost as well. So, as far as funding sources, we also looked at the types of projects and how they might be eligible for different sources of funding. And we've gone through quite a look at all that. And that is part of the question of, you're right to bring that up, because whether something's affordable or not is a factor of both the cost as well as what kind of sources you may have to pay for that. So some projects would be, attractive to certain grant sources. Others, we really wouldn't know until we get down the road a ways. Some of these grant sources like to be the last money into the pot, so that just be a little tricky at times.
Do you have a question? You had your hand up a couple times, so I want to make sure.
It was kind of related to that. I guess it seems like to some extent you're going to have to take into account what the state ferry system is. Rebuild the terminal. Just wondering how you're going to factor that in.
So a question might be how to factor in, state ferry priorities in these alternatives.
Well, you're right on point there. So when we've looked at some of these pedestrian overpasses, we've looked at them in the vicinity of Main Street, of the existing terminal, because that's going to serve, Sounder, it's going to serve community transit, it's going to serve ferry, as well as pedestrians coming off the ferry or, say getting off the train on the new west track, because they're going to second track it someday, and get over and make their way to downtown or elsewhere in Evans. So when you're looking at building, say, an overpass that connects from the passenger walk-off, you just carry it on over, but you're going to try and steer that clear or offset it from where you might be doing future construction, or you design it in a way that it's modular, that can be taken out and be reused in the new design. The mid-block overpass is associated with the train station and those platforms. And but the other thing you look at is perhaps if you're going to move things down this way, then perhaps what you've just created is a nice loop system of some, it has some other value with the city. So that's the thing, you start taking it into the overall city landscape and how things function, and you start looking at other opportunities. So, but there's a little bit hanging out there until the ferries makes a decision as to which way they're going to go. So, and right now there are other priorities for the ferries. We understand this.
Yes, in the back.
So what do you anticipate your preferred alternative will look like? Are you going to pick one of the blues, one of the oranges, one of the yellows? Is it going to be just one of those alternatives, or what are you contemplating it'll look like?
So the question is, what does the task force recommendation look like? Is it one alternative? Is it a mix? What's anticipated?
I would say that because we've been charged with coming up with both near-term and long-term solutions, that we're going to see a set that's going to be some sort of a phased implementation. That's my, I got work. And we can, if I were to put money on it, that's to be responsive, I should say, really, to be responsive to what our charge has been. I would expect something like that.
Okay, we'll come back to you. Go ahead.
Okay, I think you touched on it a little bit, but maybe you can give me a little bit more details. A more permanent long-term fix, did they look at both overhead passes for pedestrians and underground passage for vehicles, all vehicles?
So is the question for a long-term fix, did you look at overpasses for pedestrians and bikes and underpasses for cars or other vehicles?
For all vehicles, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we don't have the geometry, we don't have the space to accommodate the geometry of a general service roadway to the other side. We just don't have the room on the water side of the tracks. If the tracks could be relocated, we could do that, we could get by that. But to allow for intersections, that would be at grade after you've gone underneath. I mean, even this underpass for the ferry, we're diving down under the tracks. By the time we come up, we're barely staying within the footprint of the existing pier, the filled pier. And so that's running out like 400 feet. So you try and do that anywhere else here, you're in the water. So, but yeah, that would be a great solution.
Okay, right here.
What is the timeline then for the double track, for the extra, and how is that going to play into all of this?
So question is, what's the timeline for the proposed new double track, and how does that factor into these alternatives?
If I had another quarter, I wouldn't bet on that one because I can't tell what the railroad's going to do. They will add that track when it's the right time for their operations and the traffic that they forecast. And they've been asked many times, and they're not sharing. They do have part of the funding for that is from Sound Transit. It's part of commuter rail. And so it's a matter of when they want to spend Sound Transit's money in large part. So that's anybody's guess at this point.
Do they have the land for
Hold
that?
on, I'm sorry, hold on, we got some other questions here, right here.
I'm curious, does the railroad already own the land that they'll build on, or is that something that Edmonds is going to lease the property, or the state?
That was my
Okay, question is, does the railroad already own that right-of-way? Do they already own that land for the second track?
Yes, they own, in fact, they own much of Railroad Avenue.
Okay.
And the city has Railroad Avenue in there by the railroad's good graces, I guess, is what you'd say. Part of Admiral Way is also in the port, is also on railroad right-of-way. If they wanted to, I think they have the room to squeeze 3 tracks in there, but I wouldn't see that happening in my grandchildren's lifetime. There's other problems capacity-wise to solve before that, but they have the room. In fact, they've also already prepared the rail bed for that track. They really just have to go and put in the last ballast, ties, and the rails. They could do it very quickly when they decide they want to do it.
Yes.
Do you know if Washington State Ferry sees in the future a substantial impact to their schedules because of delays in the offload or loading of vehicles?
So the question is, does Ferry see any potential delay due to, or schedule impacts due to train delays?
This is Nicole McIntosh with Washington State Ferries, one of our task force members.
Good evening. So that was one of the concerns why Edmonds Crossing was moved so far along down the path, was because of future train crossings and our ability to load and unload the vessel. But as I mentioned earlier, the railroad hasn't projected for us an increase in train traffic that we can count on, that we can plan for. It is a concern.
Right here.
While she's still here, I do believe, and maybe this is just history, but at one time, was there a problem with doing anything to the south because of the Indians' concerns?
So the question also for Nicole and ferries is, were there any discussions of alternatives further to the south, and whether or not that would affect any tribal concerns?
I do not believe there were tribal concerns in this area.
Okay, right here.
I think this actually is part of the question that was asked previously. But the color coding that's on the picture at the front, are those yellows or I guess the others, which ones were the front runners? Which were the 3 front runners?
Great question. I'll just repeat that. The question is clarifying the color codes and the various alternatives. And I'll let Rick talk about that. But were there any front runners of those groupings? And I think maybe to clarify how all those alternatives fit together with the color codes would be good.
Yeah, so I try to use the same color, but my computer skills are dated. So the front runners in each category. For the pedestrian overpass, it was the mid-block overpass seemed to rank the highest. And that's the pedestrian overpass that we have the rendering for, that is basically spans between near the train station to near the senior center. As far as the emergency vehicle access, the red ones, the Edmonds Street overpass was highly scored choice of those. And then for the ferry access, it was a tie or back and forth between the minimum build Edmonds Crossing alternative, which would be the new dock out here to the outside of the port, and the Main Street ferry overpass minimum build. So basically, it's also illustrated there, an overpass starting from the ferry holding lanes over the railroad tracks, dropping down onto the pier. And it would have, again, that's the minimum build, so it has the same vehicle queuing capacity as we have today.
And one of the options that was being considered went over the marsh. Which one by name is that one?
Okay, which option by name
area
goes over the marsh?
that was a driving overpass?
That is the Admiral Way overpass, one of the emergency vehicle routes, a single lane roadway. And it would actually, the alignment would follow the Unocal service road here and then elevate and go over the Willow Creek and the railroad and drop down into the park, in these parking areas. Yeah.
You're in the back.
You don't have the Edmonds Street overpass as having any ferry offload or onload. Why? Couldn't that accommodate that?
So the question is, why does the Edmund Street overpass alternative not have any ferry accommodations, and could it accommodate that?
All 3 of the emergency vehicle overpass alternatives are just single lane roadways, and as such, they wouldn't function for routine loading and loading and offloading of the ferries. They just, they need 2 lanes. They need to be able to empty the boats, fill them, get them turned around and on their way. Also, the street system's not right now configured for all of that, those kinds of large movements. So the idea is they would be available in one of these extended emergencies, which we've had 3 of them since we started this study. Extended delays when the trains have blocked both Maine and Dayton. So if that's the case and you got a loaded ferry boat there, at least you could, with proper traffic control, take cars off one at a time. Trucks probably would have to stay on the dock until the situation's resolved. So that's a feature of all three of those, is that you could do emergency offloading. You could do it, pretty readily here in Edmund Street. You could, bring it down to Dayton and over that way, or you can even come all the way down and take it over this route in an emergency.
Okay, yes. Then we'll do 2 more questions, then we'll break.
If you did nothing, do the Washington State ferries want to relocate their dock?
So is the question, if no alternatives were built,
Yeah.
would ferries still want to relocate the dock from its current location?
As was mentioned earlier, back in 2007, funding for the ferry system was reduced by the legislature. So right now, what we're focusing on, of the 20 ferry terminals we have across Puget Sound, over the next 16 years are the highest priority. And what I can tell you, while I personally like Edmonds Crossing, Edmonds Ferry Terminal is in a good state right now as it stands with overhead loading, fairly recent, and it's not within our 16-year plan to move the ferry terminal.
Yes, and we'll do one more, and we'll get to you.
What is the projected increase in the number of ferries that are anticipated over the next 20 years?
Can I ask a clarifying question? Do you mean specifically for Edmonds?
Yeah, with this location.
Okay, so the question is, what's the projected increase in ferries over the next 20 years?
So we have no projected increase in the number of ferries that will be servicing Edmonds Kingston over the next 20 years.
So you think the capacity is sufficient to handle the traffic?
I didn't say that.
Yeah, I know, I just think so.
So as our funding is...
Oh, excuse me, the follow-up comment was, does that mean there's any increase in capacity in the next 20 years?
Well, no, I think the traffic's going to continue to increase. So if you don't increase the number of ferries, we're going to have big lines at either end.
That's right. So currently we have 50-plus-year-old ferries that we're trying to replace. We've been operating, as was mentioned, the steel electrics were in their 80s. So I don't know if you can imagine driving a 70-year-old vehicle 22 hours a day, every day, 7 days a week. It's hard on them. So we're trying to get the funding just to replace what we have today, the capacity, let alone a huge funding package to increase capacity.
Okay, this will be our last question, and we'll break for open house.
Just on your final recommendations, will it include an environmental analysis?
Will the final task force recommendations include environmental analysis?
That would be the next stage. What we have done in preparing this analysis is looking ahead to that. We've prepared an existing conditions report that should form the basis for much of an environmental review as far as a base case. And but that would be another step. The next step actually in such a process of implementing a project is to go through environmental review and do the formal decision making there.
Okay, thank you all for your questions and your attention. All of the alternatives are in specific detail in the back. I think many of you had a chance to see that at the beginning of the meeting. They're all grouped by the 3 various alternative groupings that are on the map and on your handout. So they're grouped together so you can compare them that way. Thank you.